You might not think much of it when you sit down next to your dog and start explaining your entire day in full sentences, complete with context and emotional updates, or when you ask your cat what they think you should do about that work situation, and you pause, actually waiting for some kind of response you know isn't coming. It feels harmless, even sweet. Maybe you laugh at yourself a little when you catch yourself doing it. But there's something happening underneath that moment that deserves attention. Not because it's wrong, but because it means something about how you've learned to handle being a person in the world. When you talk to your pet like they can understand the nuances of your life, you're not being childish or lonely in the way people might assume. You're doing something your nervous system learned to do a long time ago. You're finding safety in a relationship where you can be fully yourself without the risk of being misunderstood, judged, or emotionally abandoned. Your pet doesn't interrupt. They don't correct your feelings. They don't tell you you're overreacting or that other people have it worse. They don't change the subject when things get too heavy. They just sit there, present, and that presence becomes the only place where your internal world feels allowed to exist out loud. This isn't about whether you love animals. It's about what you've learned about people. Most of the time, when someone grows up talking to their pet like a confidant, it's because somewhere along the way, talking to actual people became complicated. Not always in obvious ways. Maybe you weren't silenced or punished for speaking. Maybe you were listened to, technically. But there was something in the listening that didn't land. A subtle shift in your parent's face when you shared something vulnerable. A sense that your feelings were a burden, even if no one said that directly. Or maybe you were heard, but only when your emotions were manageable, convenient, or easy to solve. The moment things got messy or unclear, the attention disappeared. So you learned that being fully honest, fully yourself, came with too much unpredictability. And your system, trying to keep you safe, started looking for places where honesty didn't come with consequences. Your pet became that place. Not because you couldn't connect with people, but because your pet offered something people didn't. Unconditional presence without the need to perform, explain, or justify your inner experience. You didn't have to make your sadness make sense. You didn't have to defend why something small hurt you. You could just be upset or scared or exhausted and your pet would stay. That consistency, that reliability, became a kind of relational home base your nervous system could return to. Here's the insight that organizes everything. Talking to your pet like a person isn't about the pet. It's about practicing emotional existence in a relationship where your nervous system doesn't have to brace for rejection. It's your system creating a relational space where you can be known without the fear of being too much, not enough, or fundamentally unacceptable as you are. That's not dysfunction. That's adaptation. And it worked. It kept you connected to your own emotional reality when human relationships felt too unstable to hold it. But what happens over time is that this pattern doesn't just live with your pet. It starts shaping how you move through every relationship. You begin to assume that being fully yourself with people will end in disconnection, so you edit, you minimize, you stay surface level. You become excellent at being pleasant, helpful, agreeable. And none of that is bad, exactly, but it means that the version of you people know isn't quite complete. There's a layer underneath that never gets air. And the loneliness that creates isn't about being alone. It's about being surrounded by people and still feeling like no one actually knows you because you've never let them close enough to try. Think about the last time you had something emotionally complicated going on, a fear that felt too irrational to defend or hurt that seemed too small to matter, but kept circling in your mind anyway. Did you bring it to a person? Or did you sit with your pet, speak it out loud into the space between you, and feel a little less alone just because they stayed? If the answer is the second one, that's not a sign you're broken. It's a sign you're still protecting yourself from an old relational wound that hasn't been updated yet. Your system still believes that if you show up emotionally unfiltered with a person, something bad will happen. So it doesn't. And your pet becomes the only witness to who you really are. The part that gets tricky is when this pattern becomes so automatic that you stop noticing it's happening. You might have friends, a partner, family you're close to. You might even feel loved. But if you look closely, there's probably a part of your emotional life that never makes it into those relationships. The part that feels too raw, too uncertain, too much like it might shift how people see you. That part stays with the pet. And what you don't realize is that every time you do that, you're reinforcing the belief that people can't be trusted with your full self. Not because they've proven that recently, but because your system is still operating off old information. You're not avoiding people because you prefer animals. You're avoiding the vulnerability of being emotionally real with someone who could theoretically leave, judge, or misunderstand you. And your pet can't do any of those things. There's no risk. But there's also no growth. No opportunity to discover that maybe you could be seen in your full complexity and still be chosen. There's a cost to this, and it's not the one you'd expect. The cost isn't that you're weird or antisocial. The cost is that you're living in a version of connection that's safe but incomplete. You get presence from your pet, but you don't get the experience of being seen, reflected back, or deeply understood in the way only another person can offer. You don't get to learn that sometimes people surprise you, that they can hold more than you think, that being too much for one person doesn't mean you're too much as a whole. Your pet's love is unconditional, but it's also static. It doesn't grow you. It doesn't ask anything of you. And that safety, over time, can become a cage that keeps you from ever testing whether human connection could be different than what you learned it was. This shows up in subtle ways. Maybe you notice that in your friendships, you're always the listener, never the one who brings up what's actually going on inside you. Maybe in your romantic relationship, you share facts about your day, but never the emotional undercurrent. Maybe you've become so good at being low maintenance that people assume you don't need anything. And you've never corrected that assumption because part of you believes needing something is the same as being a burden. So you keep things light and manageable, and you tell your dog about the existential dread you felt at 3 a.m, because that's the only relationship where it feels safe to admit you're not actually okay. The thing is, your nervous system isn't trying to hurt you. It's trying to protect you based on what it learned. And what it learned was that emotional honesty in human relationships leads to rupture, dismissal, or being left to manage your feelings alone. So it created a workaround. But that workaround has an expiration date. Because at some point, you're going to look around and realize that you're deeply lonely in a life full of people, and you won't understand why. Because on paper, you have relationships, but you don't have anyone who knows the parts of you that feel hardest to carry. You don't need to stop talking to your pet. That relationship is real, and it matters. But if you're listening to this and something in your chest just tightened, there's probably a part of you that knows you've been hiding. Not from everyone, just from the people who could actually matter. And maybe it's time to start asking yourself what you're still protecting against that isn't happening anymore. Here's the part that's hard to hear, but it's true. The people in your life right now are not the people who taught you that your emotions were too much. They might not know how to hold you perfectly. They might get it wrong sometimes, but you're not giving them the chance to try because you're still living like the danger is current. But what's current is the habit, and habits feel like truth when they've been running long enough. If you talk to your pet like a person, you're not broken. You're someone who learned to protect their emotional world in the only way that made sense at the time. But protection that made sense at 8, or 15, or 22 doesn't always serve you at 30 or 40. At some point, safety stops being about survival and starts being about limitation. And the question isn't whether you should trust people more. The question is whether you're willing to let yourself find out if connection could feel different than it used to. This video isn't here to fix you. It's here to help you see what you've been doing, why it made sense, and what it might be costing you to keep doing it. If this felt like someone just said something you've known but couldn't name, leave a comment about how you're feeling right now, because this can inspire others. And if you want more of this kind of content that actually explains what's happening instead of just telling you to do better, subscribe. See you next time.